Hi, this is Graham Reed, and this is the third in my series of Living the Truth. In our first video, we looked at the idea of being God's dwelling place. And then in the second video, we looked at the idea of being chosen and adopted. And this series is in the wake of us learning about being delivered and set free from the orphan spirit. Today I want to talk about this wonderful truth: I am righteous. Now the dictionary definition of righteous is morally right or justifiable. Another definition is believing and showing that you are morally right. But it also carries that idea of being clean and free from blemish. There is a beautiful verse. I want to share two scriptures with you today very briefly. The first one is in the Old Testament in Isaiah chapter 61 and verse 10. It says, "I delight greatly in the Lord. My soul rejoices in my God, for he has clothed me with garments of salvation and arrayed me in a robe of his righteousness." And this idea of righteousness is one that Paul picks up, particularly in the book of Romans when we read it. And I just want to think about what it means. This is a message for those of us who have already received Christ. And we know that when we received Christ, because of Jesus' death on the cross, we are able to be set free completely from everything that we've ever done wrong. We're given a clean start and a clean sheet. And part of that being given a clean sheet is being given God's righteousness. It's an amazing thought. But of course, God's enemy, the orphan spirit, wants to whisper the opposite in our ear. So he's the one who feeds that lie to us that we are worthless. In fact, it's a little bit like turning up to a party and looking at ourselves and suddenly realizing that not only are we terribly underdressed, but that our clothes are dirty and smelly. That's what the orphan spirit tells us. Look at you. Look at how dirty you are. And look at everybody else and look at the wonderful clothes that they're wearing. And you don't fit in. You are not righteous. But God says that we are. And that's simply because when we come to Christ, we receive not our own righteousness, but we receive the gift of righteousness from God himself. It's almost too good to be true again, as all these truths are. But what happens is that when God takes all our sin away and sets us free from that, he makes us righteous, and he gives us the gift of his rightness. It's nothing to do with us trying to be good. In fact, the scripture says that when we try to keep the rules, to obey the law, as Paul says, then we discover that we simply can't reach the mark, the standard which is so high. We're unable to do it. Our righteousness, the scripture says, is like dirty rags. So it's not a case of us trying to do better for ourselves. And sometimes the orphan spirit will look into us and say, look, you're still full of dirt. How can you call yourself a child of God when you still sin, when there's still so much rubbish in your life? And one of our responses can be to try and live a better life. But if we try to live a better life for ourselves, we get into a cycle of shame because we're always going to fail and we're going to feel more and more ashamed of ourselves. It's a little bit like looking into a reservoir and seeing that there's pollution in there and trying to use a plastic cup to bail out the reservoir to see if we can get rid of all the pollution. And it doesn't work because you can never get rid of it all. The only way that the reservoir can be made fresh and clean is if pure, clean water is poured into that reservoir and poured into that reservoir and poured into that reservoir until it displaces all the pollution and rubbish that's left. And when you look into the reservoir now, all you see is clean water. That's the way that God works in our lives. The more of him that we get into our lives, the less we have of the sin and the struggle of trying to do what's right. So it's a gift from God. It's God's righteousness that he gives us. And he tells us, no, that when we go to the party, we have been made clean. And he has given us, as Isaiah describes it, this robe of righteousness that he places on us. And that idea of being given a robe of righteousness is one that Jesus picks up in the story of the prodigal son. I'm sure that you can remember that when the prodigal son came to the end of himself, in his dirty, tatty rags, he came back to his father. His father, in grace and love and mercy, embraced him. And one of the first things he wanted to do was to put a robe onto his son. And of course, to give him a bath as well, as it so happens. So there's two things happening there. The prodigal son receives the bath, which cleanses him, cleans his body, his naked body, so that he's completely free from the dirt and the smell of pigs that he's come home with. But the second thing he does is he puts this robe on him. And the robe of righteousness that this verse in Isaiah talks about is not something to cover over our sin. It's not a cover-up. Because what God does is he first makes us completely clean and free from sin. The second thing he does is he puts this robe of righteousness on us. And that idea of having a robe put on us, it conjures up this picture of us being shown off. In fact, in Isaiah, the word is that he has arrayed us. He has arrayed us with a robe of righteousness. And that word arrayed means that that we're being shown off with this robe of righteousness that God has given us. There's a sense in which we're being shown off to the enemy. And when the orphan spirit tries to shout lies back into our lives and says, look at you, look how dirty you are, how unworthy you are, how can you stand up and say you're a child of God? Then we can say, no, look, I have this robe of righteousness. It's got nothing to do with how hard I tried to do the right thing. If that was the case, there would just be dirty rags. But this robe is God's rightness. It's his righteousness that he's given me. It's a gift from him that I receive by faith and nothing else. So when the enemy lies at us and says, look how dirty you are, how unworthy you are, you say, no, I have a robe of righteousness. And there is a sense in which that robe shows us off to the enemy. It's God's way of saying, look at this man, look at this woman. They're wearing this robe of righteousness which comes from me, and they belong to me. They are dressed well for the party. They are dressed well for the party. So we're shown off to the enemy, but we're also shown off amongst our peers. We have every right to stand up with our brothers and sisters and know that we are righteous, that God has made us righteous, and we don't have to be ashamed of ourselves. We don't have to be ashamed of what we have to show in our lives. Even while God is still pouring that beautiful clean water into the reservoir so that he can displace all the rubbish in our lives, he still gives us that robe of righteousness so that we can stand tall amongst our peers. And lastly, when in the story of the prodigal son, when the son was wearing that robe, it was the father's way of saying, look, this son who was far away from me is part of our family. He's part of my family. I'm proud that he's my son. So I'm putting this robe on him which shows that he belongs to the family. I want to finish with another verse from the book of Romans, because Paul writes a lot about this idea of being righteous and wearing righteousness that is a gift from God that we receive by faith. In Romans chapter 3 and verse 21 and 22, he writes this: "Now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe." So this is what I want to say to you today. If you're still struggling with the damage that is left behind by the orphan spirit, in other words, you still have an orphan heart, and when you come to the party, you believe that your clothes are dirty and you shouldn't really be there. You long to run home and find a cleaner set of clothes. Let me tell you this, that God has already put on you a robe of righteousness. It is his righteousness. It is his goodness that he's put over us. And before he did that, he gave us a bath and cleansed us. We're completely clean. And we're allowing God to pour in that water into the reservoir to displace all that has to be displaced so that we can become more like Jesus. And I know, again, a lot of us know this in our minds. We understand the concept of God's righteousness and that he imparts it to us. He gives it to us. We understand it here, but we still look down at ourselves and believe that we are filthy and dirty and not ready to be received as God's children. And so my prayer for you today, my prayer for myself, is that we can look at ourselves and see the garment of righteousness that the Lord has placed on our shoulders, rather than the filth of our own rags, which we're not even wearing anymore. And the enemy will try and shout and lie to us, but we will push the lies of the enemy back and say, no, I have received the gift of God's righteousness. And look, I'm wearing that robe, which indicates that I belong to him. He is my Father. I am righteous. God bless you today.